Just a quick note before today's show. While we have transformed our entire platform to respond to the ongoing crisis, increasing our production of both podcast episodes and blogs, we cannot continue without your support. Please consider making a donation or contributing as a volunteer to support our active engagement at this critical time.
A sunflower follows the sun like a dog follows its owner. Superstition is the antidote to a feeble mind.
And we're happy to check in with Natalie, a meditator from the U.S., on this interview for Insight Myanmar podcast and hear a bit about her story and background and interest in spirituality and meditation and what brought her to Myanmar and what she held with her after that trip. So, Natalie, thanks for taking the time to connect with us and tell us a bit about your journey.
Oh, sure. My pleasure.
Yeah, so to start with, just give us a bit of a background on you, where you came from growing up, whatever details are pertinent or interesting for your journey, and set us off knowing a bit about you and your background before we get to what initially drove you an interest in meditation and spirituality.
Sure. Yeah, I'm originally from Los Angeles. I grew up in Venice, California. So I grew up not far from the beach in a pretty quirky town. Well, it was quirky back then. And I lived there until I was about 17 years old. And probably, I would say around that time, around high school, kind of is when I started getting interested in some Eastern practices, started studying the Vedas and studying yoga. And yeah, left LA when I was a teenager, moved around quite a bit, did quite a bit of traveling, and eventually landed in the Bay Area in my very early 20s and have been a resident of the Bay Area on and off for about 23 years, something like that. I'm 42 now. I currently living in Berkeley, California. So yeah, a little bit of background.
Yeah, great. I'm also from northern and southern California, so not there now, but some my hometown, where my family's from, so definitely very familiar in those places. And so so that's a big jump from 17 to 42. So from of those years.
Yeah, a lot of things happening there. Like, how much do you know?
Fill us in on the what's of interest. Maybe the snapshot, the snapshot or highlights or the summary or whatever gives us a sense for who you were as you started to develop that spiritual interest, so we can ground that something in the reality of your life and what you were doing at the time.
Sure. Yeah, who I was at that time, I was really confused. I had a very hard time when I was young. I grew up in pretty challenging conditions at home in my family, had really loving parents who had just a hard time. It was just a hard time when I was growing up. Grew up in a very, very messy, divorced home. Grew up with just a lot of challenges internally and externally. Mm-hmm. And so I had a really hard time as a kid and a really hard time as a teenager, developed a lot of defenses, had a very hard time in relationships with other people, and really started straddling, I'd say, the world of kind of my spiritual life and interests, and also kind of a lot of escapist behaviors from a really young age. Mm-hmm. So for example, I discovered yoga when I was in high school. I came in through the doorway of the scriptures and then into asana practice. And at the same time, started experimenting with drugs and with smoke and weed and taking psychedelics and all those kinds of things. And that was pretty thematic of most of my, I'd say, from my teenage years through my late 20s. And I'm also a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober for a little over 13 years. And so I didn't get sober till I was 29. I started, in these kinds of practices when I was 15. So a long journey in there of straddling both of those worlds in different ways. So that's a big part of my life and my story, and a lot of trouble integrating a lot of those practices because of the ways that I was living while I was trying to really dive in at the same time.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's really valuable to be honest and frank, and as far as one is comfortable and able to discuss that, because I think that there can be, I think for Westerners that are trying to integrate what essentially is a practice that can fit anywhere, but it's really been rooted in other cultures, it can be confusing to figure out how to bring that in and adapt one's life and patterns and habits to it. And I think there can sometimes be an idealization of the kind of serenity that one takes on when incorporating this, and that especially in this day of glamour Instagram posts of perfect quotes and sunsets and candles and incense and everything else, that kind of obfuscates the messy reality of what of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back, or whatever it is, of actually trying to bring these practices. And so I think being acknowledging that imperfect nature of trying to seek that spiritual practice while also dealing with the messiness of life and patterns and family and everything else. I think that's just a much more realistic way to have the conversation. So, so thanks for starting us out with that. And I guess to follow up with what you shared, you mentioned you're kind of straddling both these at the same time. Did you feel you were kind of doing both patterns, both interests simultaneously, or was it more like delving into one and then breaking it with the other, or coming back to refuge with one? How exactly were you, as far as you're comfortable in sharing, but how exactly were you trying to integrate and manage both of these together?
Yeah, I think it looked different over the course of the years. I mean, in having had practices for so long, there have been a lot of shifts and changes and periods of really feeling deeply and consistently engaged, and then periods of not so much. And, I would say maybe I'll talk a little bit more specifically around, I stepped into, I'd say through the Dharma door. I was probably, so let me think, 2005, 2006, sometime around then, and started sitting with San Francisco Insight, and then started doing retreat. And at the same time, I got sober in 2009, so there was a period of years in there where Dharma and vipassana practice were becoming really important to me. And I also was kind of, sinking more and more into just my own struggles around alcoholism and drug use. And so I guess maybe part of how I would answer that at that time, and I sort of laugh about this now. It wasn't funny at the time, but I think it paints the picture pretty well. As I would go into retreat at the time, and then I'd come out of retreat, and then within 48 hours, I would have my face in a pile of cocaine. That's kind of what it looked like a lot for me, And so in terms of integration, it was like I'd have these really profound spiritual experiences and insight experiences, and yet they were not sufficient for me to step out of the kind of lifestyle that I had, or out of the patterns that I had. And that is a really painful really challenging and really confusing place to be.
Yeah.
And so kind of wanting to hold both of them, but not really being able to integrate the insight experiences that I was having through the practice because of just how I was living at the time and how, yeah, it's just impossible. I mean, at least in my experience, it was impossible. So that's a kind of a long answer to
Oh
say it
no.
was really challenging and confusing.
Yeah, no. I think that's true for more more practitioners than they would let on if they were, for those that are honest about some of those struggles. And I think that it can going to retreat, especially when it's this intensive retreat, it's kind of like you're realizing this idealized version of who you can be and who you want to be and who you're striving to be going back.
Yeah.
I think for me, I remember leaving some retreats and almost feeling like I had capital to spend, feeling like I had amassed such a good that I can just like, how am I going to go out and just kind of have fun with this good? Am I going to, binge some TV forever or just eat a bunch of junk food or, not get sleep and just do whatever I want? And I think, and those were some more benign ways of kind of going back into the worldly. But I think for men and for Western men particularly, and from a lot of private and trusted conversations I've had, sexuality is something, especially for single men, is on the path that is just a major struggle of whether that takes the form of pornography or of whatever, however else of trying to manage just in a Western society of raging sexual desire for young men that are on the path and going to these retreats and then coming back and not having a partner and trying to figure out how exactly to express them or suppress them or what form that takes. And so I think I've definitely talked to other male practitioners. It might be different for females, and of course it depends on the person, but who've gotten back from an intensive retreat and then struggled not just with binging food or TV or something like that, but then also just going into whatever form of sexuality or pornography there is. And so I think, again, this is just to say, like, I think these are conversations and realities that I think really do face a lot of meditators. And I think we're all for the better for acknowledging them and identifying like where the struggle is on the path and where the integration comes and the striving to better oneself and realize certain spiritual truths, but then also being as a part of the society itself, which is more conditional based on what society you live in, but then also the inherent desires of what it is to be a human in this body.
Yeah, and then just my experience and my understanding now of alcoholism and addiction, right? And what is necessary for me, at least, to be able to treat those things as a real foundation to even be able to practice genuinely and sustainably at all. And that there are a lot of moving parts there, and that the practice in and of itself, and I think this also qualifies for a lot of what you're talking about, is, there was this idea I think I had for a long time that the practice would be enough, and that was just not the case for me.
Right.
Is that the practice and even Dharma, the teachings, all of it was not a treatment for my alcoholism. And in fact, my capacity to really engage in the teachings in a really sort of deepening and sustainable way really was incredibly limited until I treated the alcoholism and the addiction, and then things really shifted for me. And that might not be everybody's story. It's not everybody's story, but I know that for me, that there was more and different that was necessary to be able to treat that in order for me to be able to really dive into the practice in a different way.
Right. And that was 13 years ago, you said
Yeah, that was 13 years ago. It's been a while.
Yeah, right. So 13 years ago, you managed to find some way of treating that alcoholism and then getting more serious on the path. Can you talk a bit about that transition?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because, like I said, it's been such a long and winding road with practice. So I got sober, and I think I had sort of a light touch on practice for a while. I had moved at the time. I mean, the other piece, that I will add, and this is a big part of just my story, and it's something that I talk about a lot because it feels important for me, is that I was also a sex worker for 14 years. So I danced in strip clubs for 14 years. And 12 of those years were years that I was sober. And most of those years I was very much engaged in practice. And to me, it's such an important thing, because I think that for most people, it sort of boggles the mind that those things can live in the same space, because the concept that people have, especially, in considering sila and sexuality and all these other things, right? It's like, how do those two things exist in the same place? And I won't go way into it because I would talk about it all day. I talk about it all the time, but that was another really big piece for me. And I bring it up also because for the first couple of years, I think when I was sober and I was dancing, and I think I wasn't quite as engaged in practice. And then I hit a pretty big spiritual bottom in my recovery around my third year, and just a really dark night of the soul, and ended up really diving back into practice, and took about a year and basically would just kind of dance in the club as much as I needed to make enough to do retreat and practice. And so, which also sounds very odd, right? Like I was working in the Spearmint Rhino in Vegas, and then I was spending time in really intensive silent retreat, and working with a mentor at the time, a Dhamma teacher at the time. And like, what did it mean to integrate those two things in a life? And so that year, a little bit over a year and a half, that I was doing a lot of practice, and was really a transformative time in my life. And the other reason that I also had moved back to Las Vegas is because there's actually a Mahasi Sayadaw monastery out there. It's one of the few, or perhaps, I don't know, maybe the only in the States, called Cheo Monastery. It's right on the outskirts of Vegas. And so was practicing a lot there with a teacher there. And it was pretty much myself and a bunch of monks, basically. Like I was going in there and chanting, and some folks like from the community, but I was definitely the only white person there, Westerner there, and just relished that place and that community. And so, yeah, definitely dove back in at that time. And then since then, I'd say I've been pretty engaged, like on and off, I'd say relatively consistently in different ways in my life. And one of my biggest interests is how to integrate practice into life, and the complexity of life, including being in places that aren't usually considered invited into the practice, like a strip club, right? Like what does it even mean to practice like sila in a strip club? Like how does that even work, right? And so that, to me, those are the things that are really interesting. It's like in real life, how do we embody and express and live a commitment to these practices and these teachings? And it's messy and complicated and interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And that real life, I can't help but bring to mind the real life of surviving in Myanmar right now. And as there's a bloody coup, and the question of violence in a place where people are also trying to bring these high spiritual teachings to a very messy reality. And I'll get to that later. I just wanted to bookmark that because that definitely made me kind of take note of just that conundrum of how do you apply these, if these teachings can't be applied to this part of life or this part of life, what is really the use of them? I mean, that's what that's coming down to. But I find it really interesting that you've spent so many years of your life trying to figure out how you can bring these practices that are so important to you and integrate them into a what I guess one can call a non-conventional lifestyle, and certainly not conventional.
One could say that, yeah. One could say that, yeah.
Certainly, perhaps for meditators. But it's funny because another thing that came to mind is that I don't know if you know this, but I've heard many stories about strip clubs and brothels in Thailand where the Thai girls who are all Buddhist will have a day where they bring all the monks in and they dress appropriately, they serve them appropriately. The monks have no problem coming because
Wow.
they are allowing them to make merit, and it's a traditional lay monastic relationship that can boggle the Western mind, but within Buddhist thought, it's not all too unusual. But I want to learn more about what, as you mentioned, bringing these things together and trying to understand how they operate and what insights you've learned. I think this is really important and fascinating. But before asking that question, before asking the question where we look at being a dancer or a sex worker and practitioner and those two worlds together, just looking only at the world of the dancer slash sex worker. And I think probably there are misconceptions or assumptions or biases or whatnot of people that don't know the realities of that, just that alone before getting into where the two come together. So I'm sure you've had this conversation with many people before of addressing the misunderstandings people might have. How would you explain this to someone that didn't really have a bearing of even really knowing what to ask?
I almost am curious about a more specific question. I mean, there are just so many misconceptions. There's so many things. Like, it's part of my life work is really kind of exposing a lot of that, and so it's hard to sum up. I think if I were to put it through the lens of even just this conversation, I think being in the body of a woman that has been in the work and reflecting on what that body means to people and just to society in general, I think that the bodies of sex workers become almost like the holders of so much shadow for individuals and for the collective. And so there's just, and you spoke a moment ago about when men go into retreat and they come out and there's all these sort of sexual energy that gets expressed in these ways, and but I can't express it and I shouldn't express it, so I have to express it, and what does that mean, and all of this judgment, all of this shame, right, all these things, and so there's a lot of undone shadow work that really gets projected onto the bodies and the beings of sex workers, right? And so with that, all of these kind of concepts about what it is to be in that work, right? What it means to be expressed in a certain kind of a way, what it means to be using one's body in a certain kind of way, which is, considered unclean or, taboo or all of these different things. And that there's not a lot of space that's made for nuance or complexity in the conversation, that it challenges people in a way that they're not really comfortable looking at. And I mean, again, there's so much that can be said about that. And, and often it's gendered in the ways that projections happen are gendered. And so women have their ideas, or, self-identified women or self-identified men. And so there's so many different conversations that happen around that and the conceptions that people have about that work. And I think it's really hard for people. Like, I get kind of a kick out of when I share with people that that's the work that I was in for so long, because people just short circuit. They just cannot understand, because of how they view me, that would be true. And that's because of the concepts that they have about who's doing the work, right? That I'm intelligent and educated and spiritual and have a certain wisdom and a place in my community, and all of it, that I work as a therapist, that I work with children for a year, that people are like, and that I'm a practitioner, and people just cannot conceive of that because of their ideas of what it means to be in that work. And I think a lot of it, there's a lot to be said about that around unseen, unintegrated parts of self. And there are parts of it that are true, right? That there's a lot that happens in that industry that's really dark. That there are a lot of ways that people are acting, that they choose to act, that they choose to work, that are really harmful, really, really harmful. That being said, this could be said of many different professions.
Right.
It's not reserved to sex workers, right? And people aren't really talking a lot about all these other ones, right? People really love to talk about sex workers. And so I don't know how much that answers your question, but I think there are just so many misconceptions, really. And I think that, again, part of what how I love to challenge people is just showing up and being open about the fact that that is my story, because I think it really challenges a lot of their ideas around what it means.
Right. So, how do you, being a person who, as you expressed, is emotional and living a holistic life with all these interests, intelligent and aware, self-aware, all these different qualities, and then being in a profession that, as you mentioned, is a profession where the darkness is being dumped on you. I can't remember your exact language, but something with the um the shadow.
But I think
Mhm,
people's shadow is just unacknowledged,
mhm,
right? These parts of self, and then they see it expressed in certain ways in sex workers or certain environments, and that is really challenging for people. It's really confronting for people.
right. And being that kind of person as you are, very, very sensitive and self-aware and such, in a profession where there's this expectation, how are you able to balance that and integrate into being your full self, and yet also dealing with this kind of shadow dumping, or what one can call it?
Well, I think to be honest with you, I mean, I'm really fortunate, and a lot of this is really privilege. My story is one that's steeped in privilege,
Mm,
and that I have had the privilege of being someone who historically has been pretty comfortable, right? That I've lived in conditions where I feel pretty comfortable in my own body and with who I am, and that has really kind of created a foundation where, like, I don't really care what people think
sure.
about the work that I do. You know what I mean? And again, I cannot say enough times how much of a privilege that is.
Mm,
That is
mm,
not the case for many, if not most people in the work.
mhm,
And so for me, people can think what they want and they can project what they want, and it's never really had much of an effect on me.
mm,
That's not
mm,
to say that it does affect me in that there are ways that I've chosen to navigate my life that are a response to that.
mhm,
I haven't shared openly in all environments. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but in general, that stuff is not mine, and I'm aware of that.
mm,
It will come up in moments, though. I mean, it certainly comes up in moments where, and I won't go into a bunch of the details, but where there are moments in life where, maybe kind of unacknowledged impacts do surface in certain circumstances. I've been in circumstances where things have come up where I do notice that there has been sort of an impact of that over time. But overall, I felt very comfortable in holding all of these things
mm.
in this one body.
Right. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, thanks for giving us just a briefer in the context of the occupation. Looking now at what you referenced early on when you introduced it, of taking that occupation and that livelihood combined with being a practitioner and the insights of those two together. And you said you spent most of a lifetime thinking about how they come together. So, what would you share about what you've learned and what you thought about regarding that?
Yeah, I mean, I could say in the context. So I had stopped doing that work for quite some time, had been really burnt out, and didn't really love how I was feeling in it for a while. And then when I was in graduate school and looking down the barrel of an $80,000
Mm,
loan and just exhausted, and I thought, I'll try it again. And
mhm,
so I went back, and it was a great decision. And at the time, I had a lot of feelings around, what is this going to look like, and can I do this work with integrity? And I met with a Dharma teacher that I have a lot of respect for here in the States, and had a big conversation about it with her, that, I'm going back into this work, and I really want to keep my eyes open here and make sure I'm doing this work
mm,
with integrity and really embodying the practice, even there. And we had we talked a lot about it. And then I had a mentor for years, and also in the Dhamma work through working with Spirit Rock. And, the conversation was an ongoing conversation of what does it mean to be in
mm,
integrity, in these spaces where there are so many opportunities to really kind of step off the beam,
mhm,
right? And a lot of that conversation centered around really simple, right? Like staying awake,
mhm,
really. And, like the Buddha talks about, like, if we're causing harm, to know that we're causing harm, right? If we're stepping off the path, if we're not in alignment, if we're not in sila, then to just really at least really know it, right? To not be ignorant around where that's happening. And for me, so much of it is really this ongoing commitment to staying awake and sensitive to how I'm choosing to show up, and that place in particular became one of the richest places for investigation, because again, there's so much opportunity to lie and to steal and to use sexuality in harmful ways, right? All these different things. And so, like, what does it mean to stay really awake to that, to commit and to recommit to what I call integrity, right? And then to really feel the sting of it when I'm not. And that would happen. Of course that would happen, right? Like I would act in ways that were maybe greedy or manipulative or dishonest or whatever it was, it would happen. I'm, it's nice to say it didn't happen all that often, but when I did, it's like, can I stay really, really present with this and know the suffering in this and have that really kind of feed into my commitment going forward. And so for me, it wasn't like I would go to work and kind of the practice would drop to the side. It was sort of the opposite.
Oh, wow.
It was like cranking up the volume on that commitment of like, it's kind of easy to show up. I mean, not easy. It's relatively simple to show up in life day to day and not like lie and cheat and be greedy and throw my sexuality around, but it's like not as easy in a club,
Sure.
And so the commitment and this sort of like reorientation to that commitment had to be really consistent and strong over the years. Yeah. And I had really overall a pretty great experience around that, overall, not all the time.
I'm wondering, getting into like kind of the technical, nerdy aspects of practice, you get kind of give a general picture there, but getting a bit more nitty gritty, the practice can focus on so many things. It can focus on the breath or the abdomen or the mental concomitants or the or arising and passing away. As we know, there's so many different ways of Buddhist practice. And one of the things I've been interested in exploring in Myanmar is when I've talked to people that have been tortured, that have taken up armed resistance, that have been in situations of total devastation and fear and terror, and they've talked about relying on their practice. I'm always very interested to go into the detail of like, well, what practice were you doing? How did it manifest? What were your insights? What was the real nitty gritty of it? So I'm curious, as you say, you were taking your practice to this livelihood and trying to make it holistic, not leaving it at the door, as you said. What specific practice or practices were you doing, and what was the results of them in that environment?
Yeah, I love those questions.
Good.
So for me, and kind of even going back to that conversation that I had with that teacher when I went back in, for me, so much of the practice is really mindfulness of body and like what does it feel like in my body. And so I can give specific examples, like one of the things that came up with her as I was talking, like sometimes there are circumstances that I would be in at work and I would know, like I would feel in the body, in the sensations in the body, like this does not feel right. Like there's something about this, there's something in the way that this is happening that I just know, like I know in and through the body right now is not the person that I'm committed to being, right? And so this sort of attuned sensitivity to the body is speaking to what it means to be in integrity, and that's that's most of the time sort of the compass that I would say that I'm attuning to when I'm talking about bringing mindfulness into wherever it is, right? But if I'm talking about the work environment in particular. And then there's also this other piece around, what does it mean to have a commitment to sila, right? Like, what does it mean to have a commitment to honesty, or what does it mean to have, a commitment to just not. It's hard in a club, right? Because I'm using my body and sexuality in this particular kind of way to get a particular kind of result. And so it gets very tricky. And so it's a lot of just attuning to like, how do I know what's real for me and what's true for me? And for me, I would say mostly so much of that work has to do with this mindfulness of body and being in the body and staying present in the body. And then, my kind of regular ongoing practice is, I mean, you've been in Burma for so long that you know all of these little nitty gritty details between all the different teachers, that I don't even, but it's really pretty simple practice, it's like mindfulness of breath, of body, of opening of the foundations of mindfulness, right? Of opening to mind, to all of these things. And that all kind of just comes into play, I would say, when I'm in the workplace, but kind of in the specifics in the moment when I'm at work, really tuning into how these things express themselves in the body. Yeah, and then suffering, right? Like knowing what it's like to be in suffering, like knowing what it's like to be in guilt and shame, right? And what do they talk about, the kind of the good shame in Buddhism, where they're like, yeah, you should feel ashamed. I can't remember the Pāḷi name right now. Oh man. It's like the sting of shame, right?
Yeah.
Like staying really present to just the grossness and the sting of shame that is like kind of like an arrow back to getting on the path, because it hurts. It hurts. Yeah.
Right. So you were basically taking it sounds like a real body awareness, and that sounds like was one of the main practices in this environment, was taking a real body awareness and a rootedness in body as you were going through different going throughout your workday.
Yeah. And I would say even in reflection, right? In reflection on, okay, and I would do this thing, like I don't believe in God, but I would do kind of these prayers on the way to work. I would be driving over the Bay Bridge, and I would do these prayers, may I, act in the service of my commitments to honesty and integrity and whatever it is. And I would kind of like go through these, on my way to work. What does that mean? Sort of, my own little version of whatever the precepts, are kind of my intentions. And then when I'm at work, just kind of like, okay, like how does this feel? Does this feel like that? And again, I'm not going to say that I'd be on the beam all the time. That would be a lie, but again, it's like this kind of bumper bowling to the center kind of over time. And can I just be with when I'm making mistakes, because I'm not a monastic, right? I didn't grow up in that culture. We can get into that after or whenever, but it's like, yeah, this is a messy kind of life, and yeah, and can I be an invitation for other people to have messy lives and be just as welcome into the practice?
Right, and that kind of leads into the thing I was thinking just now, is how did you find your relationship was to the other workers that were there? I imagine your lifestyle and commitments that you had outside were probably a bit of an outlier, but at the same time, I'm sure there were people you worked with that had their own values, their own commitments, as they were that were different, but also very much a part of their life. So talk a little bit about those relationships and about the people that you worked with, and what we can learn and know about them.
Oh my gosh, there's so many different kinds of women in a club, and I love them. I love them all. In fact, my whole kind of my current career path is really all oriented in the service of building spaces for folks in the work. I work as a therapist and as a coach, and I want to be around strippers and sex workers all the time. So there's just all kinds, right? I mean, it is, but there is a mixed bag, because it's like, in a way I was an outlier. Yes. In another way, there's all kinds of folks in there. I mean, I remember there was one period in time where there was like 5 or 6 yoga teachers that were dancing in there. There's a woman who was dancing in order to support all this plant medicine work and training that she was doing. She'd be like back and forth to Peru all the time. There's other folks doing deep spiritual work in those places. Other folks that were engaged in the vipassana work also, but then you have other kinds of people too, and that's a fun thing there too. It's funny. Like, I think about wise speech, right? I mean, in a locker room, it's like 90% unwise speech.
Sure.
All the time. Just like, talking shit, and like, it's just fun, right? It's like nonsense, which is a lot of fun to be in those spaces and just be like, okay, like, this is different, right? This is not like the conversations that I'm having maybe with practitioners, and just engaging in a way where there's kind of a light touch with a lot of that. And also knowing that, yeah, there are, I would say, many, maybe more than not, folks that are working in ways that I don't really, that are engaging in ways of working that aren't as
Right.
comfortable for me, right? And that's fine. Like that I am fine with all of that and everybody working how they want to work. And even when it means in ways that, I'm like, oh wow, that's like, I couldn't really live with myself tomorrow. But like, again, really in support of how people want to work. And that doesn't have to really be my business really. And that I don't know the conditions that everybody's coming from, right? And that not everyone comes from the same conditions and privileges as me. And so it's really not my place to have any opinions about any of that. And that I just get to stay in my own lane and how I want to be working when I'm there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And looking at the clientele, like I'm sure that's also not a as with the workers, they're not a blanket. They come in all different sizes and shapes and intentions, but and also their own backgrounds of what they're trying to do with their lives. Or what can you say about them?
Yeah. Again, there's so many different kinds of people that come in, and I really, it's really interesting how things happen in a club and the people that we end up with and what we attract and what I would notice I would attract over the years based on who I am and how I work and what other people would attract. I've had so many great experiences with people and also some not so great ones, but I mean, people come in for all kinds of reasons, but I think that the success of clubs and just like the amount of money that gets spent, like the need for those kinds of places because of the ways that people are really just the systems that people live in and the ways that they want and need to escape make those clubs very lucrative and desirable places, right? And there's all kinds of reasons that people come in, and again, that's a whole other conversation. But I mean, I think that there's so much that isn't expressed in the world for people that can be expressed in places like that in a way that feels very contained and supported and encouraged. And sometimes it can feel really great, and sometimes it can feel really dark. And it is, a lot of it is, it's delusion, right? I mean, that's what it is.
Fantasy, right?
Or experience of fantasy and delusion, right? Like that's what we're peddling pretty much in there. And sort of, and for just satisfying the senses, right? Like all these things that the Buddha was dukkha, really, right? And so there's, and so I'm not going to pretend that that's not the case, right? And understanding sort of the need for that, given the ways that people live in the systems that we live in, relationships and kind of the fear generated ways that people live a lot. And and then it gets expressed in all kinds of different ways, all kinds of different people. And having been sober in those places for so long, I would end up in all kinds of situations, of course, but got to have a lot of really great interactions with people over the years. And a lot where I'm just like, what am I doing in this situation right now? Like, what is going on here?
It sounds like it's certainly there's the fantasy and delusion and dukkha, as you mentioned, but there also seems to be a kind of exploration of subconscious and a total release of subconscious that that's not constrained, that in some ways could have some parallels with the act of meditation of going into the dark and scary. Of course, with meditation, the goal should be, at least in Buddhist meditation, that and this was one of my big insights when I started meditating, because before that it was like drugs and travel experiences and, all night this or that in my 20s. And then going to meditation was like, well, this is also an exploration of subconscious. And the huge insight I had, which I just had no understanding of prior to that, was, oh, this is not just an exploration of subconscious. This has the goal of liberation. That was completely new for me from reading Carlos Castaneda and Carl Jung and all these others. That was just really kind of like, wow, the mind is like this. And, this is what's going on under this, and how this is the collective subconscious in this way. And it's like, no, that's all fine and good, but it's the path towards liberation. So, so referencing back to your experience, I would imagine there's this kind of going beyond the conventional in which meditation does, and it sounds like your experience also does, going beyond that conventional and how we're supposed to be into a more venturing into what that subconscious, sometimes dark subconscious is. There could be some parallels in that, but certainly meditation is not just meditation, but the Buddhist path, because it's beyond just sitting formal meditation. Awareness, mindfulness in all forms is with the express goal of coming out of samsara and being liberated. But aside from that, I would imagine there could be some crossover of exploration of subconscious in general.
Interesting, and I in a lot of ways, it's like, oh, that feels and sounds really good, and in a club, I think there's this piece around, there's just not an awareness, right? It's just kind of like an unwinding, like a
sure.
There is this exploration of the unconscious, but not with any awareness, right?
Yeah.
And so yes, and right, there's a need there, right? Without the awareness necessarily, but that's the need. But yeah, again, a whole other conversation.
Sure. Yeah. And I want to go bring back the meditation part of it, because one of the things that, now that I have a better understanding, and hopefully listeners do as well, of the kind of the context and the psychology of all of it, you referenced at the beginning wanting to go to Vegas because this was one of the few Mahasi monasteries that you'd also be able to attend. And one of the questions I've been working in my mind, and as I've been reflecting on that, is that in contrasting those two environments, one environment, of course, is built and defined by sexuality and relations between the genders and rules of how they are expected to interact and are actually prohibited according to American law and safety from interacting. But it's definitely defined by some of those practices. And going into a monastery, it's the complete opposite. It's a completely, or should be a complete desexualized place, even from normal convention, normal standards of life elsewhere, of business, or being public or whatever else. A monastery is defined by, and a monastery as well, defined by being completely desexualized, completely segregated as far as possible, and prescribed by rules that are 2,500 years old of how not just men and women, but lays and monks, and especially lay women and monks, how they can interact and not interact, very prescribed rules of how things must be offered and how they can converse with each other just to protect that celibacy and the monastic life. And so what was it like going back and forth between those juxtapositions of a highly sexualized and highly desexualized environment?
It's funny. It just kind of all fit for me. I mean, I don't know. It just never,
sure.
it never struck me. I don't know why. I don't know. Some people find that odd. I'm like, oh, this is what I do. This is my practice. I'm exceptionally comfortable. I mean, I think that's part of it, right? It was like, wow, I feel like the places where I feel most at ease and most myself are, and feel kind of most home, are in, I won't say all monastic settings, because it was very different for me in Burma. And we'll probably, I'm sure we'll get to that in a moment.
Next.
But there was, And I want to also, I have like, just for time, to about 20 minutes left. So I want to make sure we get through that.
Great.
But yeah, just, in that space, and maybe because it was in Vegas too, like there was something about it being in that space. Like they know what's going on out there. I don't know what they thought about me or what I was about or anything like that. But like, I just always felt most comfortable in, I would say, like retreat settings and sort of, and monastic settings to some degree, and in strip clubs. Like those are the two places that I feel completely comfortable and myself. And so it never really struck me as like, oh, this is so weird. Or it's just like, oh no, these are both expressions of parts of myself that fit very comfortably in who I am and don't have to be at odds with one another. And they kind of balance each other out. There was something about, because, Vegas is a whole other story. Like it's just a shit show out there in the clubs and stuff. And so there was like this way that they kind of just balanced each other out
Mm.
for me in a certain kind of a way. Like I needed to be, and we chanted a lot there, in that particular monastery, which I loved so much. I haven't had much of that over the years. And there was something very just settling and balancing for me about that. And being out there living in Vegas, I lived out by the mountains in this very quiet, wide open, once you get off the strip, it's just quiet. Like my lifestyle there
Yeah.
was really very steady and quiet other than
Mm.
work. And so it wasn't, there was more space around those two things also holding them.
That's great. Yeah. So let's get into that. Let's get into that Burma trip. That's where we met or where we connected and helped
Sure.
you find some places
Yeah.
on to go. So first tell us what led you as a practitioner to want to go to Burma? What was your plan once you got there and a bit about that experience?
I just have always been curious. When I started practicing, and back in 2005, 2006, I was curious about, a lot of the teachers that I would sit with were through the Spirit Rock Teachers Council and had been, from various lineages. You probably know some about
Mhm.
them and that world. And the kind of some of the main lineages, were Thai forest. And so a lot of teachers from that had practiced with teachers in Thailand, and then also various Burmese teachers. And so I got really curious about, where are these teachings coming from, had been really curious about monastic culture in general. And so in 2007, I went to Thailand and was there for a little bit and sat retreat down south at Wat Suan Mok, and but at the time was kind of just more curious about Thailand, and then years later started getting curious about, what I wonder what it's like in Burma,
Mm.
right? There's so many of these teachings come from Burma, and just curious about the motherland of a lot of the teachings. And so when the opportunity came up to go back to Asia last time around, I decided that I would go to Burma for a bit, not with a lot of agenda. I didn't know if I was going to go really
Mm.
briefly or if I might stay for a while or if I might stay and sit retreat there, and was so happy to find you
Mm.
and get connected and just get oriented once I got there. And then ended up in
Mhm.
Sagaing for about a week, was staying up there and felt like I had just plopped right in the middle of, it's like surreal
Mm.
being there. It's like, wow, talk about being in monastic culture.
Mm.
It's like a Disneyland of monasteries
Mm.
up there. I was like, what is this place? And so ended up there, and yeah, had a lot came up for
Mm.
me when I was
Mm.
there. I had a lot of
Mm.
processing to do when I came home around my experience there.
How so?
Well, for one, I want to say that I cannot believe how the good fortune that I had when I arrived
Mhm.
there. You had connected me with
Mhm.
Alvin, and then I ended up staying. I can't even remember the name of that place where we stayed, where Alvin was living, where there was a school and
Mhm.
the
Sitagu, yeah.
monastery, and Sitagu, and got plopped
Mhm.
right into the arms of these two
Mm.
women there, these two monastic women who were just like angels. They
Mm.
just swooped me up
Mm.
for like 3, 4 days and just took me everywhere, like
Mhm.
all over the hills there in the monasteries. And
Mm.
like, I just could not, yeah, just the kindness, and it just felt like they adopted me
Mhm.
while I was there. And so I just had this incredible experience. And they both happen to speak English,
Mhm.
like nobody there speaks English. I'm like, how do you both speak English? And you're right here. One of them was 3 doors down from me, where I was staying. And
Mm.
so it was just wild. But yeah, I felt confronted a lot by, I think, seeing all the children
Mhm.
and just all of these questions that I have about, it's just so different. It's hard to put into words. I remember when I came back, I had so much sort of internal, I don't want to say struggle, but just all of these questions. And I was able to sit. I don't know if you know Temple
Yeah.
Smith. He's a
Yeah,
teacher who
actually,
practiced many years in
yeah, we're
Burma.
gonna do a podcast next month, actually. So yeah.
Oh, that's great. He's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, when I got back, I had two teachers, Matthew Brent Silver and Temple Smith, and I called them both. And I was like, we need to talk because I need to work out some of what's going on in my experience around all of this. And they both helped me a lot to orient around a lot of what was coming up, especially Temple. I'm excited for you guys to talk. And just, so I can give one specific moment. I was staying at Sitagu and I would hear this chanting every night. And one night, I thought, I'm going to go see where this chanting is coming from. And so I walked out just a little ways up the road and I got to this, is it called a nunnery? The ones with the nuns in it? Or,
right.
Yeah. And there were a couple of nuns out front and they were like, oh, come in, and so I went in and I went upstairs and the chanting was coming from all these children who were chanting. And there were maybe like 40 of them, girls, and they were from like, gosh, as young as like maybe 4 years old until probably like 17, 18. And I sat in there for, like a while, maybe half an hour or something like that. And I don't know why, but I just started crying. Like there was something to me that, because I come from a different culture, was actually kind of painful and disturbing to me about it. That like these little tiny children, and you've seen how they chant in the monasteries too. It's like, rah, 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 rah,
right.
Where it was just so in conflict with my concept of children and raising children with attachment and warmth and not that they don't have all those things, right? Because I would see all of those things in the nunneries, but there was just something about it where I just felt like, wow, the way this practice lives in me as a Western, self-identified white woman, having grown up in a city and all that, there's just no comparing it to the way that it lives in the bodies of folks in monastic culture who have essentially been conditioned and steeped in Dharma from the time that their little brains are even forming, right? And all of these questions I started to have about just humans and relationship and love and attachment and the complications of growing up in attachment and family, right? And how much of my own work involves navigating that mess. And just seeing in monastic culture, like, wow, these children, I mean, it's just Dhamma. That's it. From the very beginning, right? Especially in a place like Sagaing, where that's just it, right? And yeah, I just had a lot coming up around that. And I feel like it would be like a whole other podcast to get into all of it. But it was just, it really, a lot of the way that I romanticized monastic culture, I think was really challenged as well when I was there. Very much. Other things that I would see too, or it's just so woven in other things that I would see around, a lot of what's happening in the conflict there, right? And Suu Kyi, like all of these posters everywhere, and the way that lived in the culture, and the ways that conversations were happening within Buddhist communities there around what was happening in terms of the conflict was very confronting and confusing for me. And Burma in general is a very challenging place, is very confronting, I think, as well. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, it's interesting. I'm talking to the author of a book on Monday called Have Fun in Burma, and it's the subject of that novel is actually similar to how you're describing. It's about a young American. Well, you weren't so young when you went, but it's about a young American who goes to Myanmar and ends up volunteering to teach English at a monastery and is confronted with all her impressions of what she thinks Buddhism is and what monasticism is, and just that whole cultural conflict, as well as the political crisis at the time playing out. And that's, and I think the author just does a remarkable job at capturing, really understanding the two opposing viewpoints and where they come and don't come together. But, what I found in my time.
I'd love to read that if you could send, if there's something you could send, I would love to.
Oh, for sure. I recommend it. It's easy to get through. I also it reminds me of my own insight after being in Myanmar for some years and realizing that it seems like we have this extraordinary thing in common, and we do actually. And by we, I mean me as a Westerner and in a traditional Burmese Buddhist society, of Shila, of the precepts, of meditation, of the belief in nirvana, of the understanding of samsara, all these other things. We have so much commonality, and yet sometimes it would be hard to find a way to express my spiritual path and understanding and challenges and ambitions, or ambitions is the wrong word, but aspirations, that in even with all that in common. And the insight that I had is that my practice is not so much a rejection of society, but it's standing against the shape of what my society is, and it's really standing against the flow to say I'm going to sit and I'm not going to do this and I am going to do that, and it's really being an outlier. And many people who choose to do that, we talked before the interview about the more conventional checklist of many meditators who come on the path, and it involves everything from veganism to tofu to riding a bicycle to and a concern for environmentalism. And there's just this whole kind of, it doesn't capture everyone, but it certainly is that segment which leaves the conventional Western world to want to find the spirituality. And yet in Myanmar, meditation is the apex. It is the top level, top rung of the traditional conservative religious society. And so these activities are the same, but they're capturing and involving a completely different and even opposing segment of society. So it's like, as we have all of this in common, we also have all of this which brought us to this thing in common, which is directly opposed. And that's not a bad thing that it's opposed. There's you could certainly learn about yourself and others by coming from different places, but it does have to be acknowledged. It's not like meeting another Westerner who came to the path and seeing what diverged and what converged on our experiences. It's really meeting someone that, like, their meditation or supportive meditation is the height of their traditional religious conservative activity, whereas for me it's the height of standing up against the flow of a raging Western society. So
Yeah, well, and it's funny, like even when I hear you say the word meditation, right? Like meditation, it's like, oh, I'm a Buddhist, I meditate, right? And out there, being in the monasteries, like I remember, being with Suchari the whole time, and she's like, oh, we don't really meditate.
right.
She's like, our life is practice. Like
Yeah.
this living, this
Yeah.
monastic life is the expression of Dhamma, right? And even kind of in the weeds, like in the details, I think it's like, wow, this is such a just the embodiment and the expression and the practice is so different, right? This is just life. This is like Dhamma expressing itself through life. And so, yeah, there were just a lot of things that sort of confronted my concept of what it means to be a practitioner and my understanding of it. And then not to get into the whole question around gender, right? This whole piece around like showing up in a monastery, and I just had to take a picture. Back then I was on social media. Of course, I had to post it, and it was like, no women beyond this point.
Right.
In this monastery, I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
It's like, it's like, oh, self, not self, not self, not except unless you're in a woman's body, right? Like we don't welcome that self.
Yeah.
So it's just like things like that are again, just woven into the culture that we're just confronting for me. And again, lots more to say about all that, I'm sure. But so it was good. It brought up a lot for me. It challenged a lot for me. I was grateful to have teachers that I could come and kind of sort through some of that with when I came back, because I felt just a lot of confusion in a lot of ways, which is great. I love leaving with more questions than I arrived with, really.
And have any of those been resolved since you've come back and had a chance to process and think about them, or have there been partial answers?
Yeah. It really, it goes back to this piece around what is this practice, and what are these teachings? How are they expressed in the conditions of who I am in this relative, embodied lifetime right now, right? That I wasn't born into those conditions, but that these teachings have entered the stream of my own experience. And so what does that mean? And what does that look like in my day to day? And it doesn't have to look anything like that, right? But to also really respect and honor that that is where these teachings come from, right? And that it's expressed different in different places through different bodies and different cultures. And, and then deep down at the root of it, we're all touching into the same place. I think at the end of the day, when we have the privilege to be able to touch into that, but that this practice expresses itself differently, in a woman body in the Western urban world than there. And there are many things that I will never understand.
Right.
About that. There are many things that I will never understand because it's so different than my experience, and I just have to be okay with some of that, and that I don't necessarily agree with. I mean, that was the other big thing, right? It's like, wow, I'm not down with a lot of what's happening here. And can that be okay?
Right.
Can this still be the practice that I'm devoted to, even though I don't necessarily agree with and align with that, and I'm okay with that, right? It's like I'm okay with having that conflict.
Right. And to close on bringing us to the present terrible, awful reality of what has happened to those places where we've spent time and where you've spent time. We connected last year when I just got the awful news that soldiers had burst into one of the nunneries where, I don't know if you stayed, but it was definitely where the nuns that were there you were connected to and you visited and probably were served tea and other things, and that soldiers had burst through there and in the middle of the night had stormed the walls. They weren't dressed in fatigues. They just started walking around with their weapons, barking out questions. When the elder nuns of the nunnery tried to find out who they were greeted with being assaulted, beaten, pictures of their bloody robes, which were then sent to me in videos and audio of those beatings, the traumatization of all the young nuns, 4 or 5 years old. That this was just this. I can get through this story in telling it without breaking down now, because it's happened in the past long enough ago, and I've explained it enough times. I was just simply not even able to talk about it without tearing up. Just the imagery of these men breaking into a safe environment of young girls and elder nuns, watching after them and acting with this kind of violence, this kind of senseless violence that the regime has become. I don't really know where to go with this. I mean, we're not going to understand this in this conversation. There's nothing, there's no wise sayings or reflections we can have that's going to make it better. But at the same time, it's something that we can't shy away from. We have to acknowledge that this is what has become of the country. This is what is happening, that Buddhist nuns and girls are being beaten for no reason by military and pro-military men on suspicion of something. And this Buddhist environment that we knew, this tremendously welcoming and gracious environment that we were brought into is now just facing something which we can't begin to imagine, and that we have to bear witness and acknowledge.
Yeah, it's horrific. I remember getting that message from you and also breaking down. It's just inconceivable, and reaching out, to Sudakari and getting some of the details from her, and it's just inconceivable. It's, like you said, there's no words that could even kind of package it up in a way that feels even close to okay. And it's awful. I'm sorry that you had to hear that and see it too.
Yeah, I guess to make it personal, I guess I'm just wondering how are you holding this in your heart? Knowing this happened and being close to these people and the gifts you were given, how you've talked about all the things in life you've had to process. That's what this whole conversation has been. This is something beyond anything else, perhaps, of how to process and understand. But how did you work just to sit with that and not shy away, and yet also, we're helpless in some way as well.
Be honest. I be honest. I mean, I just cried and cried when I got it and I read the message. It's just, I feel it right now, actually, while we're talking about it. It's just, and then my mind goes to these places where I kind of will play it out, right? Like I have to kind of play out the whole thing in my mind to really feel I don't know if that's just a human thing or what it is, right? Just imagining just how horrific this scene must have been, and remembering all these little girls that I spent time with when I was there, and I have all these photos of them and of them laughing, and just knowing what happens when attacks like that happen, right? Knowing what happens to little girls' bodies in these kinds of circumstances, and that, yeah, I don't, I don't know what to say about it, right? I mean, there's nothing, like, how does one process that except for it's just excruciating.
Right.
It's just
it's
excruciating, and it's human, right? I mean, this is what's so painful, is that this is what happens. This is what humans do. And
right.
Yeah, it's crazy to feel so far away, right? That this is happening all the time, and then we live our lives every day. I show up, I live my life, I do what I do, and this is what's happening. And that it is in so many ways just out of my hands, and I just don't understand, honestly. There's some things I'll just never understand. It's like no amount of wisdom will ever feel like enough to be able to pretend to understand that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's violence, it's cruelty, it's terror, it's fascism. That was the only way I can understand it. This is just a fascism that doesn't make sense through humane understandings. And this is a land that has given us some of the noblest and most refined spiritual teachings, and yet is also just eating itself up right now. And something that we need to embrace the totality of it, and know who we are and where we could stand to bear witness, and whatever we can from here to know that they're not alone. And I know I'm with that in note, I'm conscious of your time. I know you have to go soon, and I'm
so sorry. Well, in 6 minutes, I'm actually going to look at a home. And
okay. So I was thinking maybe we can close by bringing together this, this kind of holding and bearing witness of what has happened, and the senselessness of it, but also acknowledging that this is a place and these are people that have given these very special spiritual gifts that remain with us. And so in closing, thinking about your experience there, and with the people, with the practice, and certainly it's not perfect. It's that's true of any place. And yet there's also things that can teach us and we could walk away with. So looking at some of the positive memories, the inspirations, the things that warm you up when you think about them, the big learnings or insights you had, what can you share with us about Buddhist Burma that you experienced and have taken away with you as a practitioner?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about those two women, and I'm thinking about Sudakari in particular, because for some reason right now, and just this most incredibly loving being. I'm thinking about her and all of the little nuns. She called them little nuns, which I thought was this little nuns. Mm-hmm. And just the way that she was like basically mothering all of them. I think there were like 8 or 9 of them. And I'm just, and I think because so much of the time monastic culture, and this is perhaps somewhat gendered also, but can feel very dry and flat, and like a lack of emotion or tenderness or care. And that this woman was everything but that. That's what really sits with me, is like this expression of that life, of that culture of Dhamma, of monastic life, in just the most loving, tender, gentle, nurturing being that was this person. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what's really emerging for right now. It's just something that really struck me in what stands out for me of being there.
That's great. Yeah. That's great. Well, thank you for leaving us with that, and thank you for this whole discussion. It's been so wonderful and thought-provoking. I hope it's been good for you as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I am looking forward to hearing more of your podcast and hearing your talk with Temple too.
Yes.
It sounds like a lot of fun.
We want to present a special opportunity for donors who are committed to our show. While we want to stress that we greatly appreciate donations of any size, Larger donations, of course, are particularly helpful. For that reason, we're encouraging donors with means to consider sponsoring a full episode for a one-time donation of $350 or more. Donations in this category can include a dedication, if you'd like, to a person or organization, and as well as a quotation or expression. Or your generous donation could be anonymous as well. The choice is yours. In either case, it would give you the satisfaction of knowing that you enabled at least one more episode to be produced for the benefit of the people of Myanmar who have suffered so much at the hands of the military. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.